You've probably noticed something strange. The people who talk most about peace are often the ones engaged in the most conflict. The friend who preaches unity is usually fighting with someone. The company that proudly calls itself one big family somehow always has internal wars. And you, yes you, right now as you listen to this, there is someone in your mind, someone you've quietly categorized as wrong, as difficult, as the problem. You might not consciously admit it, but they're there. And the truth is, you need them there. We don't talk about this. We pretend we're above it. We imagine ourselves as rational, fair-minded, peace-loving people who simply want everyone to get along. But watch what happens when you remove someone's enemy. Watch carefully. When the villain disappears, when the opposition crumbles, when the person you've defined yourself against suddenly agrees with you, something unexpected happens. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something closer to panic, a subtle psychological instability. Because if there's no resistance, who are you now? This isn't about morality. This isn't about being good or bad. This is about structure, psychological structure, because meaning itself is constructed through contrast. Think about certainty, true certainty, that absolute conviction that you are right. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Right compared to what? Because certainty doesn't exist in isolation. It requires opposition. You feel right because something else feels wrong. You feel intelligent because something else feels foolish. You feel virtuous because something else feels flawed. Without contrast, your confidence has nothing to stand on. This is where the modern illusion begins. We've built identities around the belief that evolved people transcend opposition. That wisdom means neutrality. That maturity means rising above conflict. But look closer, very closely. They didn't eliminate enemies. They replaced them. Now the enemy is ignorance, or negativity, or people who still think in terms of enemies. Same pattern, more sophisticated disguise. Your brain is doing something right now. Even as you hear this, it's scanning, sorting, evaluating, safe or threatening, agreeable or dangerous, acceptable or wrong. You don't choose this process. It's automatic, because your mind is fundamentally a pattern recognition survival system, designed to detect threats, designed to divide reality, designed to create categories, us and them, right and wrong, safe and unsafe. This division isn't a flaw, it's architecture. But here's the modern complication. The external dangers have reduced, the internal machinery has not. So what does a threat detection system do when threats are scarce? It manufactures relevance, it searches harder, it lowers the threshold, it finds enemies in ideas, in opinions, in strangers, in comments, in tone, in interpretation, because a brain without resistance feels like a brain without purpose. Let me show you something painfully familiar. You're in an argument, and suddenly, you sense the other person might have a point, just a small crack in your certainty. What happens next? You defend. Reflexively, instantly, your mind scrambles for inconsistencies, recalls past mistakes, finds loopholes, reframes logic, not because truth failed, but because identity activated. Because if they're right, then your previous self-definition destabilizes. We build identity in opposition, not just through beliefs, but through anti-beliefs, not just through values, but through rejected values. You don't just define who you are, you define who you are not. And that not becomes psychologically essential. Remove the enemy, and meaning itself trembles. Notice what happens after victory, after proving someone wrong, after defeating an opponent, after winning the argument. There's satisfaction, but it fades disturbingly fast. And underneath, a strange emptiness emerges, because the struggle wasn't merely resistance. It was direction, it was narrative, it was psychological movement. Agreement alone is rarely fulfilling. Pure harmony feels static, predictable, lifeless. We crave friction because friction implies motion, growth, energy. Watch conversations where everyone agrees. They collapse into boredom. Someone introduces disagreement, even trivial disagreement, because tension sustains engagement, opposition sustains cognition, resistance sustains psychological stimulation. Social media exposes this mercilessly. We scroll past hundreds of agreeable posts to engage the single opposing one, the one that irritates, provokes, triggers, because conflict confirms identity, and identity confirmation is neurologically rewarding. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never consciously recognize. We are often emotionally sustained by our enemies. Not because we consciously enjoy conflict, but because opposition organizes the self. Every time you think about how wrong they are, you reinforce how right you are. Every time you replay the argument, you rehearse your identity. Every time frustration arises, you experience the satisfaction of differentiation, which is why letting go feels like loss, not peace, loss of structure, loss of clarity, loss of psychological momentum. They are not merely the villain in your story. They are the contrast that makes your story coherent. And if they vanished tomorrow, you would unconsciously search for another. Because the pattern doesn't end, the machinery persists. And this is where things become even more unsettling. Because once you see this pattern externally, you start noticing something far more intimate. Something you carry within yourself, something shaping your inner life every single day. And this is where things become even more unsettling. Because we don't just create enemies in the world, we create them inside ourselves. Right now, as you listen to this, there isn't just one you present. There are multiple versions competing silently. The disciplined self, the tired self, the ambitious self, the fearful self, the rational self, the impulsive self. And much of what you call identity is actually the management of internal opposition. We like to imagine the self as unified, stable, consistent, but your inner life tells a very different story. Every day is negotiation. Every decision is conflict. Every intention meets resistance. You want to work. Another part wants to rest. You want to save money. Another part wants immediate pleasure. You want long-term growth. Another part wants short-term comfort. We label this lack of discipline, but structurally, this is the same enemy creation mechanism turned inward. Because without internal resistance, there would be no experience of effort. And without effort, there would be no experience of virtue. Think about that carefully. If something is easy, automatic, effortless, do you feel proud of it? Rarely. Pride requires struggle. Struggle requires opposition. Opposition requires an enemy, even if that enemy is yourself. So the mind divides, creates friction, manufactures internal tension, because identity feeds on overcoming. This is why self-improvement becomes psychologically addictive, not because it fixes you, but because it sustains the perfect internal enemy, always present, always solvable, never fully defeated. Every flaw becomes structure. Every weakness becomes narrative fuel. Every limitation becomes identity reinforcement. I am someone working on myself. I am someone improving. I am someone fighting my habits. Remove the struggle entirely, and something unexpected happens. Disorientation. Because now, who are you? Victory over the self can feel strangely empty, which is why new flaws appear, new goals emerge, new inadequacies surface. Not coincidence. Psychological continuity. You do not merely want progress, you want perpetual becoming, because becoming sustains meaning. Being does not. Now let's go deeper. Your morality itself depends on enemies. Honesty exists because dishonesty exists. Courage exists because fear exists. Kindness exists because cruelty exists. Strength exists because weakness exists. Virtue is relational, defined by contrast. Without villains, heroes lose definition. This explains something fascinating about human groups. Why communities fracture after victory. Why movements expand threats. Why organizations search for new dangers once old ones disappear. Because collective identity depends on shared opposition. We are the people who stand against. Take away the against, and coherence collapses. This is why revolutions rarely end peacefully. Why moral communities develop purity spirals. Why groups dedicated to goodness become obsessed with detecting badness. Not hypocrisy, structural necessity of identity preservation. Now observe your opinions, your strongest beliefs. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. How much of this belief exists independently? And how much exists because something else must be rejected? You don't just believe X, you believe not Y. And often the emotional intensity comes from rejection, not evidence, which is why persuasion feels threatening. Because changing beliefs means surrendering enemies, and surrendering enemies means surrendering psychological stability. Changing your mind is rarely cognitive, it is existential. And here lies one of the most uncomfortable realizations. Opposition is not merely a social phenomenon, it is the architecture of meaning itself. Language runs on contrast: better, worse, right, wrong, success, failure, progress, decline. Remove opposition, and meaning itself dissolves. Thought becomes shapeless, experience becomes flat, identity becomes undefined. Even paradise becomes psychologically unstable. Every utopian story introduces conflict, because without resistance, reality becomes experientially empty. Look at your free time. When nothing forces you, what do you choose? Games, stories, sports, challenges. Everyone's structured around obstacles, opponents, enemies. We do not relax through peace. We relax through chosen struggle, optimal resistance, controlled friction, safe enemies. Even meditation becomes a battle against distraction, against thought, against the wandering mind. We cannot even pursue peace without framing it as opposition. This is not dysfunction. This is human cognition functioning exactly as designed. But awareness changes the rules. Because understanding the pattern doesn't eliminate it. It transforms your relationship to it. Most enemies in modern life are junk food enemies. Low effort stimulation, high emotional reward, zero developmental value. Arguments that go nowhere. Conflicts that change nothing. Oppositions that maintain identity but never expand capability. But some enemies are different. Some oppositions forge transformation. A difficult craft. A demanding discipline. A genuine intellectual challenge. A fear worth confronting. A truth worth wrestling with. These enemies generate growth rather than mere psychological occupation. And this is where conscious choice enters, not elimination, selection. Your brain will always seek opposition, but you are not required to accept every enemy it generates. The question becomes brutally simple. If struggle is inevitable, what struggle is worth your life's attention? There is a danger hidden inside everything we've discussed so far. A danger most people never notice, because it doesn't look like a problem. It looks like meaning. Enemies don't just shape identity, they can imprison it, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. Think about your recurring frustrations. Not the dramatic ones, the ordinary ones, the patterns that repeat across years, different faces, same emotions, the same type of conflict, the same irritation, the same resentment, the same mental arguments replayed endlessly, that coworker who always annoys you, that personality type you can't stand, that ideology you instantly reject, that group of people you feel superior to. Ever notice something strange? How familiar your enemies feel, how predictable, how consistent across time. Because your brain doesn't just seek enemies, it seeks familiar enemies, safe enemies, comfortable opposition, predictable resistance, opposition that confirms who you already believe you are, opposition that requires no psychological adaptation, opposition that protects identity rather than challenges it. This is where the trap begins. Because familiar enemies create the illusion of movement without requiring transformation. You feel engaged, you feel alive, you feel intellectually active, emotionally stimulated, mentally justified, but structurally, nothing changes. Anger feels like energy, but often it is repetition. Outrage feels like action, but often it is stagnation disguised as intensity. Resentment feels like progress, but often it is psychological inertia wearing emotional armor. This is why outrage becomes addictive, because it produces the feeling of significance. Without demanding growth, you feel like you're standing for something, defending something, fighting something meaningful. But ask yourself carefully, Has this battle actually expanded you, or merely occupied you? Because the brain prefers enemies that stabilize identity. Growth requires enemies that destabilize identity, and destabilization feels like danger. Real growth enemies are uncomfortable. They challenge self-concept, threaten certainty, demand adaptation, force cognitive restructuring, which is precisely why most people avoid them. It is easier to fight people than to fight limitations, easier to attack opinions than to confront fears, easier to oppose strangers than to restructure the self. Look closely at your strongest emotional triggers. What instantly irritates you? What instantly provokes defensiveness? What instantly activates judgment? Because those reactions reveal something critical, not about the world, but about your psychological boundaries. Your enemies often guard your identity. They mark the edges of who you believe you are. Anything that threatens those edges feels hostile. Anything that destabilizes certainty feels dangerous. Anything that challenges internal narrative feels like an enemy. And so, you remain locked inside predictable battles, predictable thoughts, predictable oppositions, predictable emotional loops. Years pass. Conflicts change. Identity remains structurally identical. The prison is not conflict. The prison is unconscious repetition of conflict. Because familiar enemies maintain comfort. Growth enemies demand evolution. But evolution requires psychological instability. And instability feels like loss of control, loss of certainty, loss of identity, which is why the mind clings to safe opposition. Here is the paradox almost no one sees. Enemies can create meaning, but they can also prevent growth. Not all opposition is equal. Not all struggle is valuable. Not all resistance is productive. Some enemies keep you alive, others keep you small. And unless this distinction becomes conscious, the machinery runs you completely. You believe you are choosing battles, but the battles are choosing you. Beneath our discussions, something subtle unfolds, rarely questioned, yet it feels like reality itself. Your enemies are more than just people, obstacles, or disagreements. They are integral to the story your mind constructs about the world, and crucially, about you. The human brain doesn't just perceive reality. It builds a narrative to make it tolerable. It seeks coherence, predictability. You experience an interpretation, a model, a story. Every story needs structure, consistency, causality, and meaning. Your brain constantly edits reality, simplifying complexity, reducing ambiguity. It assigns roles, heroes, villains, allies, threats, not because the world is simple, but because cognition demands compression. Ambiguity is psychologically expensive, uncertainty metabolically costly, contradiction cognitively exhausting. So the brain organizes, stabilizes, creates patterns, oppositions, and enemies. Enemies simplify reality, bringing clarity, direction, and emotional coherence. Consider the comfort of certainty, even negative certainty, even anger-based certainty. Why? Because certainty eliminates ambiguity, which is a deeply uncomfortable state. Your enemies stabilize your world model. They explain difficulties, unfulfilled outcomes, and frustrations. Without enemies, reality becomes chaotic, random, unpredictable. Then you must confront something far more unsettling. Maybe there is no villain, maybe no conspiracy, no singular cause, just complexity without intention. This thought is deeply destabilizing. Enemies preserve the illusion of control. If something is your enemy, it's at least graspable, nameable, targetable. But if difficulty is structural, random, emergent from systems beyond comprehension, then anger loses direction, identity loses anchor, narrative loses coherence. Humans instinctively prefer hostile explanations over chaotic ones. It's their fault feels safer than I don't fully understand why this happened. Blame restores psychological stability even when inaccurate. Notice how easily the mind creates intentionality. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Instant interpretation. They're disrespectful. A colleague responds coldly. Instant interpretation. They're against me. A stranger disagrees. Instant interpretation. They're ignorant. The brain fills gaps with meaning, and meaning often requires opposition. But reality is rarely personal, rarely intentional, rarely structured around you. Most events emerge from complexity, stress, fatigue, bias, miscommunication, context you cannot see. Yet your brain resists this interpretation. Neutral complexity is psychologically unsatisfying. Enemies create emotional simplicity. Complexity creates cognitive strain. Now let's go deeper still. Your enemies don't just stabilize your view of the world, they stabilize your view of yourself. Identity is also a story. I am competent, I am rational, I am moral, I am intelligent, I am aware. Every identity story needs threats to remain meaningful, resistance to remain convincing. It needs contrast to remain visible. Without opposition, self-concept becomes fragile, undefined, unverified. This is why criticism feels disproportionately painful, why disagreement feels like a personal attack, why correction feels humiliating. Because your enemies protect your identity narrative. Anything that destabilizes the story your mind tells about you feels like danger, which means something extraordinary is constantly happening. You are not merely reacting to reality. You are defending a psychological model. You are not merely resisting others. You are protecting internal coherence. You are not merely arguing ideas. You are preserving identity stability. And once you see this, conflict itself looks very different. Arguments stop being intellectual exchanges. They become collisions of world models. Disagreements stop being about facts. They become about identity preservation. Resistance stops being external. It becomes structural cognition at work. Every mind fights to maintain coherence, certainty, and narrative stability. And enemies are the easiest way to achieve that. Here is the paradox most people never notice. Enemies are psychologically stabilizing. Even when emotionally exhausting, instability is more frightening than conflict. This explains why people cling to resentment, why grudges persist for decades, why conflicts survive long after resolution is possible. Because letting go is not merely emotional release, it is narrative collapse. Without the enemy, parts of your story dissolve, parts of your identity destabilize, parts of your meaning structure weaken. Peace can feel like emptiness, because peace removes resistance and resistance sustains psychological motion. This brings us to something even more unsettling. If enemies stabilize reality, if opposition structures identity, if conflict preserves meaning, then what does awareness actually offer? Not escape, but choice. There is one final layer to this discussion, and it may be the most uncomfortable one of all, because after everything we've explored, external enemies, internal enemies, narrative enemies, identity enemies, there remains one opponent far more powerful, far more persistent, far more invisible. The enemy you almost never recognize, because it doesn't feel hostile. It feels like you. Your interpretations, not reality itself, not other people, not circumstances, but the meaning your mind assigns to them. Because here is something most people never fully grasp. You do not suffer events. You suffer interpretations of events. Two people experience the same situation. One collapses, one adapts. Same reality, different meaning structures. A setback becomes devastation for one and fuel for another. A criticism becomes humiliation for one and information for another. A failure becomes identity damage for one and data for another. What changed? Not the world, but the interpretation model. Your mind is constantly generating explanations, stories, causal frameworks, judgments, predictions, and these interpretations quietly shape your emotional reality, your confidence, your motivation, your stress, your sense of meaning. Yet most people never question the interpreter. They question reality. They fight circumstances, fight people, fight outcomes, fight situations, rarely asking, is the problem truly the event, or the story I'm telling about the event? Because interpretation is not passive perception, it is active construction. Your brain compresses complexity, fills gaps, assigns intention, creates meaning. Often without evidence, someone ignores you. They disrespect me. Something fails. I'm not capable. Difficulty appears. this shouldn't be happening. Notice what happens there. Interpretation transforms neutral uncertainty into emotional certainty, and certainty, even painful certainty, feels psychologically safer than ambiguity, which means something extraordinary is happening constantly. You are not reacting to reality, you are reacting to your model of reality. Your stress is often interpretation-driven. Your anger is often interpretation-driven. Your insecurity is often interpretation-driven. Your resentment is often interpretation-driven, because interpretation defines experience. Now here is where things become deeply revealing. Your enemies often exist inside interpretations. They are against me. This always happens to me. People like that are the problem. I'm stuck because of them. Enemies simplify interpretation. Interpretation stabilizes identity. Identity stabilizes perception. And so the loop continues, but awareness disrupts the loop. Because once you start observing interpretation itself, something shifts. The world becomes less hostile, less personal, less threatening, less rigid. Not because reality changed, but because distortion decreased. Here is the paradox most people never see. The most exhausting battles are often against imagined certainty, not actual threats, because interpretation can create suffering without necessity, conflict without value, stress without structural cause, which means the most dangerous enemy is not opposition, but unconscious interpretation. So after everything we've explored, let's slow this down. This is the part most people rush past, where insight becomes transformation or just another idea. You will not eliminate struggle, opposition, or resistance. It's not an accident of life, but built into existence itself. Every system functions through tension. Movement requires friction. Form emerges through contrast. Your mind is no different. But there's something profoundly important hidden here, subtle and easily missed. You're not trapped by conflict, but by unconscious conflict. There's an enormous difference. One drains you, the other refines you. Unconscious struggle feels chaotic, personal, overwhelming, like life is happening to you. Conscious struggle feels directional, informative, almost surgical, like life is revealing something to you. The events may look identical, but the experience becomes radically different, because awareness inserts distance, and distance changes everything. When you are fully identified with your thoughts, every disagreement feels like an attack. Every obstacle feels like injustice. Every difficulty feels like personal failure. Every enemy feels undeniably real. But when you begin observing your own mental processes, something extraordinary happens. You start noticing interpretation forming in real time. You see judgment arise instead of being consumed by it. You see emotional reactions activate instead of being controlled by them. You see identity defend itself instead of blindly obeying it. And this tiny shift, this almost invisible gap, is where psychological freedom begins. Not because life becomes easier, but because experience becomes clearer. The world stops feeling like a battlefield filled with villains, and starts feeling like a complex environment filled with stimuli, neutral events, ambiguous situations, interpretations waiting to be assigned. And ambiguity, once terrifying, becomes strangely liberating, because ambiguity means possibility, flexibility, multiple explanations, multiple responses, multiple meanings. Instead of, this is bad, you begin asking, what else could this be? Instead of, they are the problem, you begin asking, what interpretation am I constructing? Instead of, this shouldn't be happening, you begin asking, what expectation is being violated? Notice the difference. One reaction collapses perception, the other expands it. One reinforces automatic suffering, the other introduces cognitive space, and cognitive space is power. Because once you stop reacting to interpretations as if they are reality itself, you reclaim something critical: choice. Choice of perspective, choice of meaning, choice of response, choice of engagement, choice of which struggles deserve energy and which ones deserve dismissal. This is not passive detachment. This is perceptual sophistication. Because awareness does not weaken you, it stabilizes you. When enemies no longer automatically dominate perception, attention becomes less hijacked. Emotions become less volatile. Identity becomes less fragile. You stop being pulled violently by every irritation, every disagreement, every perceived threat. Life becomes less reactive, more deliberate, more precise. And perhaps most importantly, more peaceful. Not because conflict disappears, but because conflict stops owning your internal state. This is the paradoxical freedom nobody talks about. Not a life without resistance, but a mind no longer enslaved by resistance. Not a world without enemies, but perception no longer addicted to them. Not the absence of struggle, but struggle without psychological captivity. Because once you truly see how your mind constructs meaning, constructs opposition, constructs identity, constructs enemies, you are no longer fully governed by unconscious patterns. You still feel, still react, still experience tension. But now there is awareness alongside experience, and awareness changes the texture of reality itself. Difficulties become information, triggers become signals, conflicts become mirrors, emotions become data. Nothing disappears, but everything reorganizes. This is the quiet shift, not dramatic, not loud, not motivational, but deeply transformative. Because the greatest change rarely happens in circumstances. It happens in perception. And perception is the lens through which your entire life is experienced. So the real question was never, how do I eliminate struggle? The real question is, how do I relate to struggle consciously? How do I choose battles wisely? How do I interpret events flexibly? How do I engage opposition that expands rather than exhausts? Because your life will always contain resistance. But your suffering from resistance is not always inevitable. Awareness is the difference. And if this perspective has shifted something in you, if it has made you observe your own mind differently, if it has made you question your reactions, your conflicts, your interpretations, then you already understand the value of this conversation. Because this channel exists for exactly this reason. To explore what most people never pause long enough to examine, to question what feels obvious, to reveal the invisible mechanics shaping thought, behavior, identity, and perception. Most people live inside their minds. Few ever learn to observe them. Even fewer learn to understand them. If you value that kind of clarity, that kind of awareness, that kind of depth, subscribe now. Because this exploration, this dismantling of unconscious pattern, has only just begun.